From Autosport.com and Autosport Magazine, I'm Kevin Turner, and this is the Autosport F1 race review. Well, after what seemed like ages, we finally got the F1 season back underway with the Miami Grand Prix. Some teams brought upgrades. It was quite a dramatic race and a close finish, actually, for several of the leading positions. So lots to talk about. And joining me to do that is Jake Boxall-Legge. Jake, welcome. It seems ages since we sat down to do one of these. So what did you make of round 4 of the 2026 F1 season?
Well, I really enjoyed it, and I thought that F1 certainly needed to prove a point, I think, after the opening 3 races, which I think were enjoyable, but I think there were
I enjoyed them, must admit, yeah.
Yeah, but I think that, there are a lot of people that had legitimate concerns about how things were going with the new regulations, so tweaks have been made, which I'm sure we'll get into, but I think those didn't really play a role in how Miami played out. But yeah, I think it was generally enjoyable, as you said, lots of battles for the important positions on the grid. Teams moving up and down the order. So yeah, I think there's a lot to talk about.
There is, but before we get into the subjects, let's just quickly go through the results. So it was a third win for Kimi Antonelli at Mercedes, winning despite the fact they didn't bring an upgrade, or a significant one, which we'll get to, just ahead of Lando Norris for McLaren, the reigning world champion, a bit disappointed, I think, to finish second after winning the sprint. Oscar Piastri taking the final podium position after quite a dramatic last few laps. George Russell 4th. Max Verstappen 5th with a penalty that actually didn't make any difference in the end for crossing the white line at pit exit. Lewis Hamilton fairly quite sick after damage early on. 7th was Franco Colapinto, arguably his best race in F1 for Alpine. Charles Leclerc penalised back to 8th. For leaving the track without justifiable reason after damaging his car right at the very end. And then Carlos Sainz and Alexander Albon rounded out the point scorers for Williams. And that leaves the championship looking probably not as we would have predicted at the start, which is Antonelli now has 20-point lead over teammate George Russell. Charles Leclerc is third on 59 and Norris is on 51, the same as Lewis Hamilton. And in the Constructors' Championship, Mercedes already has a 70 points lead over Ferrari, with McLaren third on 94, and those top 3 already well ahead of everyone else. Well, before we get into digging into the detail, let's just hear from Stuart Codling, who was out in Miami.
So what do we make of the Miami Grand Prix weekend? Slightly disappointing sprint, felt a little bit flat on Saturday. Qualifying on Friday was intriguing. And Miami, well, it's Miami, isn't it? It's an interesting place. It's certainly etched a space on the F1 calendar. It's been a busy race. I get the impression the fans enjoyed it. The mood's been quite up. A slightly less talk about the effects of the regulations. I think maybe a little bit of fatigue setting in. I think Jake will probably be unpacking the effectiveness or otherwise of the little rules tweaks that were made ahead of this weekend. It was slightly peculiar for me that, having given themselves the option of dropping to 7 megajoules, they went to 8, but I think the race went okay. It wasn't too marred by yo-yo racing. It was quite eventful. Max Verstappen, I think, slightly happier, more chipper than he was. I think the various teams that have brought upgrades have changed the dynamic a little bit, which gave it the feeling of the season almost beginning again. And it felt like it needed that refresh because there's been a fair bit of cynicism. Obviously, yesterday the FIA president gave a briefing to select media, not including us, not including quite a few other people, talking about a return to V8s, largely normally aspirated come 2031 or 2030. That's something I will be writing a column about this evening and will be appearing on the website by the time this video is out. And yeah, everyone's leaving. Good time has been had by most of us, and certainly by a resurgent McLaren team. So like I said, that's pretty much changed the dynamic of the season so far. I think it's made things very interesting. It's almost a shame we didn't get to see a wet race today, and really the picture changed throughout the day when my alarm went off at 7 o'clock in the morning. I pulled my earplugs out and I could instantly hear thunder. I could see lightning cracking around the blinds. And I thought, well, this is going to be an interesting day. And then basically it stopped. So just in time for the Formula 2 race. That was quite eventful. I suggest people go and have a look at whatever the highlights are on YouTube or wherever. Yeah, I think that was certainly a template for what not to do in a wet race. By the time the Grand Prix start rolled around, it was mostly dry, and the race itself panned out more interestingly than the sprint race, and certainly that was a factor of lower ambience, lower track temperatures, and the track being green again. So I think in many ways F1 dodged a bullet in terms of it not being a boring race. It was certainly more interesting than it might otherwise have been. And do I regret there not being a bit of a wet race? Yes, I do. I think it would have been interesting. I think it's necessary for Pirelli to really get the intermediate tyres into shape because they've not had enough running on them. The suspicion is that they're a little bit too hard and they don't warm up quick enough. So part of the package of changes that was announced prior to the Miami Grand Prix was raising the temperature of the tyre blankets from 60 to 70 degrees. And the next step is to find out if that works. But to find out if that works, we need a wet race. So roll on Canada, we'll see what happens there.
Right, well, I mean, it's interesting to get Stuart's take on how the weekend went. But I mean, first of all, Jake, we should get into how the race was won because it boiled down to a two-horse race between Antonelli and Norris, and Lando at the end was like, oh, we could have won that, and it was old school. It was an old school strategy decision that essentially decided it in the end.
Yeah, exactly. When you look at, and I think there's a lot of context to consider here as well, because the important thing going into the race was the expectation of rain and when that was.
Well, they moved the start time forward as well.
Exactly, they moved the start time forward by 3 hours because US law, if there are thunderstorms 10 miles away to an event, everyone has to go inside and wait basically 30 minutes until there's sort of been no thunder or lightning or anything like that, as I understand it. So that was a threat that was going to apparently going to happen. There was going to be rain at some point, according to the weather radars. So the teams were trying to sort of work whatever was happening there out, but also trying to sort of retain that sense of normality, and they couldn't give up a normal race in case the rain didn't occur. So you had this interesting battle at the start where Norris kind of got ahead of Antonelli just before the safety car, and then got ahead of Charles Leclerc as well. Antonelli laced past Leclerc, and then Norris had built up a 2.2 second lead. When it became apparent that the rain wasn't going to come, Mercedes simply got the position, went into the pits first, took the initiative first. So Antonelli came in. Outlap was very, very good. 2.2 second pit stop. Norris, not a great in lap, and 2.8 second pit stop, so he loses 0.6 in the pits, loses time in his in lap, and so they're side by side.
Yeah, and Antonelli's got the fresher tyres, up to temperature.
So that was the point at which the race was pretty much won. You then think, okay, because Norris was able to overtake Antonelli early in the race, why couldn't he do that again? It was a little bit of the McLaren was very, very good on the tyres, but you were getting to that point later in the race where it was just becoming more and more difficult. And Antonelli wasn't making any mistakes as well. I think that was the point at which Norris could get past the first time round, because Antonelli spent a little bit too much energy trying to pass Leclerc, and Norris capitalised on that. He was told to kind of just wait it out and let them yo-yo, and that's what he did. But Antonelli didn't have to use his energy for anything except defending towards the end of the race, so there were fewer mistakes to make, and Norris couldn't find a way in. So that was basically why the race played out as it did.
So now, are we talking about Antonelli not just as a championship challenger? Is he now the favourite? Because it's a very muted weekend from George Russell. Okay, I know it's not a track that he likes very much. Antonelli actually outqualified him both for the sprint and the Grand Prix last season. Although I guess Antonelli at that point, the races still he wasn't really putting them together, so George still finished ahead in the race. But is Antonelli favourite now, or is that still a little bit too early to say 4 rounds into what at the moment is looking like a 22 race calendar?
I think it's too early to say for 2 reasons. Number one, Montreal's coming up, and that's a circuit that George is very good at. And secondly, and again, as we'll probably discuss in a minute, other teams have started to come back into this with upgrades, with finding the vast amount of potential that's available with these brand new cars, because this is their first set of upgrades. And obviously you get to a point of diminishing returns eventually, but with the first kind of batches throughout this season, you're going to make up quite a lot of time. Mercedes does have one to follow in Montreal, but I think the other teams have made up quite a lot of time, and they're still in this. I know it doesn't look like it at the moment. I know that we've had 4 Mercedes wins on the bounce, but they're still in this. And I think it's a bit too early to declare a favourite. I'm sure some people still will, but I think it's a bit early.
Well, let's get into those upgrades then. So McLaren, Ferrari and Red Bull bought significant upgrades. I guess you'd say on the race pace, McLaren's upgrades and Red Bull's upgrades definitely thumbs up. Verstappen much closer to the pace. Obviously, he had a very dramatic race we'll get on to later on. Ferrari...
I think Ferrari got something out of their upgrades. The problem that they had was, again, the engine's still a little bit down on power. So they're hoping that they can get something through the Aduo system, the additional development and upgrade opportunities system that allows them, if you're lower than 2% down on power, then you can get an upgrade, and then 4% you can get 2 upgrades. So Ferrari's hoping to get something out of that. I think Ferrari, again, the upgrades did generally work. I think the second thing was just tyre degradation throughout the weekend. So you could see that Ferrari had made a little bit of a step in qualifying. Qualifying hasn't been actually that good for them this season so far. The race pace had been better, you would probably say. But yeah, I think they made a step forward, but it was just overshadowed by the amount that the McLaren and Red Bull did. You know, they were kind of in this kind of 2-tier front 4 system. They were very much the tier 2 teams, and now they're sort of very much in this mix. So it's one kind of homogenous blob of top teams at the moment, once again. So
which is kind of what we want, because we want
exactly.
multiple. I mean, where do you think that McLaren and Red Bull found? Because I know Red Bull have been saying the car's been overweight, but I think it still is. Or have they got it down to the? Are they down to where they need to be now? Where have the 2 teams found their advantage? Do you think found the upgrades?
The Red Bull is still a little bit overweight, but not by a significant amount. But one of the biggest problems with the car was just lack of mechanical grip, and particularly when you're kind of dealing with longer radius corners or low speed corners, the front end really wasn't biting in the Red Bull, and that's why Max Verstappen was struggling so much, because he was just not able to get that front end into the corners and drive the car on the nose like he wants to. There was a new floor, new side pods on the Red Bull, the impressive Macarena wing that Ferrari has also got and has used properly for the first time this weekend. All of this was contributing to a car that was just a little bit more stable in those corners. And Verstappen did spend quite a lot of time in the factory as well, trying to get the car physically to what he wanted as well. So he was sat in the cockpit and trying to reconfigure what he needed to feel a little bit more comfortable in the car. So I think that's one point. McLaren, again, just adding load to the car. I think fundamentally it's a strong car. I think it was just missing downforce from the start of the season. So, you know, more downforce at an efficient rate is what you want when you're developing a Formula One car. And I think both teams just added that load on and got cars together that were just a little bit easier to handle. So when it comes to Miami and you've got those little fiddly little sections to deal with, that's kind of what you want. You want that predictability. You don't want to sort of turn the car and not know whether it's going to hit the wall on the other side or not.
Well, talking about hitting the wall, that was a brilliant segue, because before we go on to Red Bull, Max Verstappen, let's talk about Charles Leclerc. Thought was one of the stars of the weekend, right up to almost being on the podium. And then, I mean, he admitted to making a mistake, because he actually let Piastri through in their battle for third, didn't he? Then had the spin, putting it in the wall. And then he had, I guess, the argument for the leaving the track is that he used leaving the track to maintain a higher lap time, rather than he would have been slower, which is why he got the penalty. So I kind of can see that. But it must have, you do the driver ratings. Was Leclerc's the hardest one to do? Because it was so good right until the very end.
Yeah, it was really, really difficult, because you don't want to sort of let one thing undo everything else.
But it literally did in this case, didn't it?
Yeah, and that's why it's a lot easier when, if a driver has a good qualifying, but then the first couple of laps in the race, they've just smacked it into the wall. That's easier to deal with, because the driver has sort of, by definition, ruined the whole afternoon. So when you've got that sort of oeuvre from Leclerc of what happened over the afternoon, led the race for a little bit, had an excellent start, driving really, really well, struggling with the time management towards the end of his stint, which is why he sort of fell backwards at the end of the medium stint, and then lost ground to Piastri as well. He was planning the fight back, which was to his detriment, because he let Piastri go. He was like, I'm going to get him back a little bit later. got on throttle a little bit too hard at turn 3. Pretty much did what Verstappen did at the start, spun the car, just lit the rears up, hit the wall, and that was kind of it. The suspension was damaged by this point. Probably could have sort of trundled around neatly, but at this point he knew that he was going to be slow. Russell and Verstappen were coming, and he was like, oh, I need to keep fourth here. And it was a bit of a sort of desperate Dan last few laps for him. So yeah, I think he has taken the blame for that. He's taken full responsibility for that, and I think that's fair. I did think that the 20 seconds was a little bit harsh because ultimately he did get past at the end of the day, but
I suppose it discouraged people trying.
Yeah, it's not done on end result. It's done on intent. So
yeah.
It's understandable.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. Well, let's get on to Max Verstappen. We talked about the upgrades to the Red Bull, which I have to say, I mean, they've done a great job. The powertrain's better than people expected. Now the chassis is moving into the ballpark. Qualified on the front row. I feel like we saw almost like the best and worst of Verstappen during the race. Obviously, a very rare spin. You say he wants a more pointy nose, possibly not that pointy at turn 2. I know it was on the exit rather than entry. Then they threw the dice, didn't they, with an unusual strategy, which would have worked if there'd been a later safety car and he could have got a short pit stop. That would have, he probably ended up in about the place that he would have done anyway, do you think?
Yeah, I think so. I think it was damage limitation after that spin.
Worth a punt.
Yeah,
basically.
exactly. He knew that he could get through everybody that wasn't a top 4 contender, pretty much, and did so quite forcefully, I should say. He was, I think, irritated by his own kind of actions, a little bit irascible, and just wanted to make up the ground as quickly as he could. Put a few noses out of joint in the meantime. Carlos Sainz, for example, said he treats the midfield like not like scum, but can't remember what the exact words were, but something like that.
Well, Carlos was half right, but I think he treats everyone like that. I don't think I don't think it's anything to do with the midfield, midfield runners. Go on.
But I think Albon gave him a little bit back, and this is a man who a few years ago said, "Oh, they raced me so hard at I think it was the Eiffel Grand Prix of 2020." Albon now the one giving it back, which I thought was quite good. And then Max complaining that he was too close to the bollard, which was quite funny. As you said, pitted early, did it all again once the safety car was cleared, but he had to do such a big stint on those tyres, and the fuel's burning off, and the Red Bull doesn't seem to be too bad now, particularly at hanging on to the tyres, but when you're dealing with a circuit like Miami and it's really low grip and you're sliding a lot, it's really, really easy to overheat the tyre surface. So he can't take too much out of them, which is why I sort of found it interesting that he was fighting Norris and Antonelli so hard when they were coming up behind him, because it was a 20-lap difference between compounds at this point. It's pretty much a foregone conclusion. So it did seem sort of a bit unnecessary.
The lunge on Norris into the hairpin. But then Lando's seen it before, so he just went, oh, okay, thanks very much, and tucked up underneath it. And, But I thought, he forced Lindblad off after his spin. He had his lunge on Sainz, upset him, his lunge on Albon, that he then thought, he moaned about, as you say, Albon's response, a bit hypocritical. That's like, fight by the sword, die by the sword. But then his move on Leclerc, his move back on Leclerc, I thought was mega at the end. Now, maybe there's the front runners who are more used to racing against Max, know when to, we know he's going to come lunging down the inside, so I'm just going to let him go. But then brilliant stretching the stint that long. So basically, are we back to old Max? Felt like he was a little bit quiet. I mean, in the car, out the car, not so much quiet, but in the car, first 3 races, more quiet than normal. But this looked like, oh, hello, I'm back.
Yeah, I think it's just that sort of comfort thing, that having that car that can do what you want it to do. When you're given a new car at the start of a Formula 1 season, I suppose it's just like buying a new car for the first time, and you don't feel familiar with everything, and you're trying to sort of feel your way through it and everything. I think it took a slightly longer run up for Verstappen because it was just so different to anything that came before, particularly when he's been given some really, really successful cars over the last few years. So I think it's just that sort of readaptation and realignment process that took him a little bit longer, but I think he's there now. I think he's got the hang of it.
Yeah, we're going to see him when he races, aren't we? I think in 26. Well, let's look a little bit further back. So before we get into perhaps some of the more general rule changes, Colapinto and Alpine Unfortunately, Pierre Gasly, of course, was taken out early. While Liam Lawson, in your piece, you said he had a problem, so it wasn't just a rubbish understeer moment into Gasly. So there's, for those who can see the screen, there's poor old Gasly upside down. But a great race for Colapinto and encouragement for Williams.
Yes,
do you think?
Absolutely. I think so. First of all, Colapinto, I think that was probably his best weekend in Formula One. It's just been sort of a confidence thing. I think he's sort of finally got to a point where he knows what he's doing with the car setup wise. He's Alpine has sort of been at great pains to say that he's not a huge step behind versus Gasly in terms of spec and that sort of thing. I think Colapinto still had the old rear wing, but he did such a good job with that car this weekend. And he was quick. That's the main thing. You look at some of his stints from last year, and Colapinto, whether it was strategy or whether it was his own driving, he was just slow, especially compared to Gasly. And yeah, he had moments where he might have looked a little bit quicker in qualifying, but yeah, race pace wasn't good. But it was really good yesterday in Miami. And then for Williams, took a bit of weight out of the car. A few aerodynamic upgrades, still not out of the woods, still a long way to go with taking weight out.
Which Sainz was very quick to point out, wasn't he? It's like, this isn't where we want to be. And I think Albon also said, we were quick here last year, so let's just wait and see if this is a long-term improvement.
Yeah, exactly. And I think of this kind of midfield contingent, Haas didn't have a good weekend because I don't think the upgrades that they were going to bring, I think it was supposed to be a bit more comprehensive, but some of the parts didn't work in the simulation, so they didn't produce them. Racing Bulls had difficulties, as we've said. Lindblad didn't have a very good weekend at all. Lawson had that gearbox issue, so when he was going into the corner, he had no way of getting the right amount of retardation at the rear axle, so he just went straight into Gasly, despite being given a load of room. So you're going to continue to see this ebb and flow. So there'll be other circuits where Williams does well. Again, there'll be other circuits where Haas is back to where it should be. Alpine seems to be a step ahead of all of them now, and Red Bull seems to have cleared that now as well. So it should be sort of, again, quite an interesting battle between all of them.
Well, let's get on to this kind of wider discussions about the rules, of which there are far fewer discussions about the rules over this weekend. There were a few tweaks. Do you think they worked? There was certainly less super clipping, but how much was down to the rules changes, and how much do you think was down to just the track layout?
I think, because there was always going to be, especially when you look at the end of the two straights, there was always going to be some super clipping there, and I think that by upping the rate from 250 kilowatts to 350, I think they've successfully shrunk some of that.
It was far less noticeable, wasn't it?
Yeah, exactly. And I think it is going to be tested when we go to circuits like Silverstone, that kind of thing. I think the next few that we're coming up to, so Montreal, Monaco, Barcelona, Austria, it should be generally fine. It shouldn't really be noticeable. Silverstone will be a bit of a test, and we'll have a few others after that that'll be a bit of a test. Miami was going to be good for it anyway. So, but as I said, the period has sort of been shrunk. We didn't see any lifting and coasting really into those types of corners, which was good. We didn't really see the effect of the reduced power around the lap during the race, but you're not really using that power anyway. That was more of a sort of contingency measure to stop big overspeed and that kind of thing. So I think we didn't really see too much of that. So I guess that was okay. The other thing that I think confused people a lot is this FIA suggestion that it would reduce the base recharge per lap to 7 megajoules from 8, but Miami was 8 anyway. Actually, the baseline was still 8, but Miami was going to be 9. So they have still reduced it by a whole megajoule. But the FIA hasn't done a particularly good job of clarifying that. And again, I think there are a few more tracks as well that were supposed to be 9 or even 9.5, which will now be 8 or 8.5. So we'll still have circuits like that. But I think the median 7, that will be remaining in place, and then there'll be some circuits that have been 7 and will now be 6 per lap, for example. So it's sort of, if they just said we'd reduced it by a megajoule per lap, that would have been sensible. But It's because it's such a sort of moving goalpost. That's why it was confusing.
And did you feel qualifying? Because I think one of the most difficult or offensive, perhaps egregious problems with the new rules has been push more in qualifying, get punished for it in a way. That Charles Leclerc was particularly vocal about that after Suzuka. Do you feel that made progress in Miami?
I still think that there was a lot of deployment element to it. I don't think that there was the issue that drivers couldn't feel that they couldn't push. But there was still a little bit of counterproductivity in the, yes, the drivers could push, but there was deploying at the right times was more beneficial. And I think you kind of saw that through the ebb and flow of qualifying where McLaren didn't get the deployment strategy quite right. And so that's where it lost time. And Red Bull did, for example. So I think there's still that element. That element still needs to be a little bit more natural. But I don't think it was, as you say, I don't think it was as egregious as it was before.
Do you think they'll tweak it? But I guess they need a few more races and tracks before they can really do anything too bold.
Yeah, I think so. I think, yeah, they'll continue to tweak it because I think everybody wants qualifying to be this sort of natural thing and energy deployment to be a consequence rather than something you have to proactively do. So I think it is worthy of a few more tweaks. But yeah, we'll see where we go in the next few rounds.
And finally, what did you make of the actual wheel-to-wheel racing? Max Verstappen's charger cycles, he was out of sync. We had it was interesting that we were able to see a bit of overtaking early on with Leclerc, Antonelli, Norris, but then in the second half of the race, it felt much more like a normal Grand Prix in that Norris couldn't get there. So does that suggest we're kind of getting to a slightly more sensible? You want to keep some of that so that we don't end up with the old processions that we used to have, but also you don't want it too yo-yo-y. So do you think we're a bit closer to that? There was some good overtaking moves during the race.
Yeah, I think the balance was spot on for Miami, to be honest. I think that there's still going to be people that aren't going to be happy, but I think you could give them any kind of Formula One, they wouldn't be happy.
Well, you can't please all the people all the time.
No, and because when I was watching the sprints as well, like, let's be honest, not a lot happened. So I kind of almost said, well, Formula One's back to normal then. Like, it's interesting because for years and years, and I was one of the things that I like to do when, if there's a day where I sort of can't think of a column, so that was, we hadn't had racing for a while, so that was last week. So I like to go through the archive that we've got and just go through some of the old articles and that kind of thing. It's really interesting reading about changes from previous seasons, rules changes that they did make to try and improve racing because they think downforce had been too high or that speeds were too high. I think it's really interesting sort of going back through time to see the changes that were made that didn't work. And now we've got a situation where we've got a change that has definitively given us more wheel-to-wheel racing, but it's not the right kind. So I think that it's a movable feast, and I don't think it is, you could change whatever you wanted. I don't think that you could legitimately add more. So it's at what point do you kind of just go, well, we want more overtaking, so let's just put it in like this. I don't think it is artificial. I still think it is. It's not like you've got, and as we've said before, it's not like you've got one driver with an advantage and one being disadvantaged. Yes, you've still got the overtake mode, but I don't think that's particularly powerful. It's when drivers use the things that they've got, that they've all got commonly, and use them at different times to get an advantage here or there. So it's not like someone's got a surplus of resource and someone else doesn't.
As shown by Antonelli saying, I overstretched fighting Leclerc, got done by Norris, didn't do that in the second stint. So that was a driver-led decision-making experience improvement sort of thing. Okay, so before we finish off, what are you looking out for most for Montreal? 3 weeks' time, Canadian Grand Prix, always a good venue. What are you expecting from that one? Mercedes got some upgrades to bring, of course. Yeah,
Mercedes got some upgrades. So Montreal's, it's not, there's parts of the circuit that aren't dissimilar to Miami. You don't have, the corner sections are a bit more stop-start. Again, it shouldn't be a circuit where we struggle with energy or anything like that. But it's also going to be one of those circuits that sort of you need to trim out for a little bit because the corners that you do have are generally quite short radius and you don't need loads of in-corner downforce for them. So the teams are going to have to trim out. It's going to be all about little bit of power, a little bit of drag, seeing who does what with upgrades. I think McLaren has a bit more to bring as well. And it'll be interesting to see if Ferrari can get its own car dialed in a little bit more. And it'll be interesting to see if Red Bull can stay in that pack and prove that its pace Miami wasn't sort of like a one-hit wonder, as it were.
Yeah, lots of things to look out for. Well, thanks very much, Jake Boxall-Legge. Thank you as well to Stuart Codling for joining us from Miami. And thank you very much for joining us. We'll be back soon with another Autosport F1 review.